Welcome to this explainer on the authoritarian economy. Have you ever wondered how targeted regimes actually stay afloat when the entire global financial system tries to completely cut them off? I mean, you'd think they just crumble, right? But instead, these states adapt in some pretty fascinating ways. The mechanics behind their survival and how they navigate immense financial isolation are absolutely incredible to unpack. Let's get right into it. So, how exactly do sanctioned regimes survive? Look, when Western powers weaponize their financial systems to restrict a state's access to capital, targeted regimes don't just sit still. No way, they adapt. They build alternative networks, and they exploit domestic vulnerabilities to maintain their iron grip on power. To see exactly how this plays out, we're going to look closely at the source material from two really insightful reports. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're looking at the economics of regime survival, Syria's corrupt war economy, the human cost of corruption, Russia's financial warfare strategy, the strategic pivot to Asia, and finally, reshaping global financial systems. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the economics of regime survival. Okay, so to really grasp this, let's dive into a crucial distinction drawn directly from a report by the Syrian Legal Development Program, or SLDP. To understand state-level illicit activities, we absolutely have to recognize the difference between grand corruption and petty corruption. Grand corruption is high level. It's the abuse by officials who are actually making the rules and policies, often involving massive sums of money, across the highest tiers of both the public and private sectors. Petty corruption, on the other hand, well, that's your daily administrative abuse by public officials when they interact with ordinary citizens. The key takeaway here? In authoritarian economies, grand corruption isn't just a flaw in the system, it basically becomes the system itself. Moving right along to Section 2, Syria's corrupt war economy. The source report details exactly how crony capitalism essentially flourished in Syria. The regime rewarded loyalists with monopolies and super lucrative contracts, creating what's known as a conflict elite. We're talking about regime-affiliated businessmen who profited immensely from wartime smuggling and literally seizing properties from displaced persons. This whole illicit economy was structured around three key pillars: the drug trade, systematic extortion, and the complete manipulation of reconstruction efforts. To give you a real sense of the sheer scale here, consider the number $10 billion. According to the source material, that is the reported annual export value of the Captagon drug trade. Just let that sink in. Under the intense pressure of international sanctions, Syria essentially transformed into a narco-state. You have this industrial-scale drug operation, allegedly helmed by elite divisions right inside the regime's inner circle, turning into one of the country's most lucrative industries. This staggering flow of illicit capital, that was a direct mechanism used to entirely evade the financial impact of sanctions. Now let's look at Section 3, the human cost of corruption. This brings us to a truly shocking statistic from the SLDP report: 51 cents. Through the imposition of heavily distorted exchange rates on international aid agencies, the Syrian regime actually diverted nearly 51 cents of every single humanitarian aid dollar in 2020. That amounted to an estimated $100 million over 2019 and 2020, just funneled directly into the foreign reserves of their sanctioned central bank. Think about that for a second. They literally weaponized international relief efforts to fund the state. The real human toll of all this grand corruption is that it fundamentally dismantles human rights by weaponizing everyday desperation. You know, when vital public revenues are diverted away from basic healthcare and education, it forces citizens into just impossible situations. For instance, an entire industry of disappearance emerged, systematically extorting an estimated $900 million from families who were just desperate for information about detained loved ones. Even the physical reconstruction of the country gets exploited. Less than 10% of a so-called reconstruction tax actually went to rebuilding private civilian homes. The rest was completely siphoned off to the military. And because of this systemic abuse, marginalized groups and women face severely heightened vulnerabilities, including horrific exploitative practices like survival sex in aid settings. Meanwhile, on top of all that, vast areas of the environment are being intentionally destroyed through forest fires, literally just to clear land for corrupt commercial development. Let's pivot now to Section 4, Russia's financial warfare strategy. So, pivoting to our second case study, a briefing paper by the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, or FIA, points out that freezing over half of Russia's $640 billion in foreign reserves in 2022 was just an unprecedented shock. As Russia's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov is quoted saying, "It's just thievery." This reaction really serves as a narrative hinge in the source material. It shows us that, hey, even though Russia had been preparing for sanctions, the sheer magnitude of having their massive war chest frozen basically evaporated any purely economic considerations they still had. It completely catalyzed a shift from this gradual de-dollarization plan to a rapid, total rubleization of their economy. It became a pure matter of geopolitical survival. Drawing on some fascinating data from that FIA briefing paper, we can clearly see Russia's aggressive, top-down strategy to de-dollarize over the last decade. Just look at the US dollar's share. It dropped from 43% back in 2014 down to just 16.4% in 2021. That is a massive drop. In its place, the Chinese yuan went from literally 0 up to 13%, and their gold reserves more than doubled, surpassing 20%. The underlying strategy was crystal clear here: dump the dollar and start hoarding assets that Western sanctions couldn't easily touch. But it goes way beyond just currency reserves. Russia proactively built its own domestic systems to completely replace Western financial plumbing. The FIA outlines three key pillars here. First, Mir cards, which they introduced as a national alternative to Visa and MasterCard. Second, the SPFS system, designed as a direct alternative to the SWIFT messaging network. And third, the ongoing development of the digital ruble, aimed directly at reducing dollar dependency and blunting future sanctions risks. They weren't just reacting, they were actively constructing a parallel financial ecosystem. Which brings us to Section 5, the strategic pivot to Asia. Replacing the dollar obviously requires new partners, right? As the FIA report notes, neither Beijing nor New Delhi joined the Western sanctions regime, which presented a pretty unique opportunity for Moscow. We're seeing Russian banks totally double down on embracing alternative currencies, particularly the Chinese yuan and the Indian rupee, just to conduct international trade. After the invasion of Ukraine, the demand for non-Western financial networks absolutely skyrocketed, which really accelerated the integration of these alternative systems. These countries are actively interlocking their economies to bypass what the report calls the U.S. nexus, creating this comprehensive financial shield. It starts with direct currency exchanges, like China paying for Russian coal in yuan. Once that capital is secured, consumer access gets routed through new networks. This actually led to a tenfold surge in Russian demand for Chinese UnionPay cards right after Visa and MasterCard suspended operations. For state-level transactions with India, they bypass the SWIFT network entirely by finalizing a rupee debit account system that utilizes Russia's SPFS. And get this, when digital networks are still deemed too risky, they are even reverting to old-school barter-based mechanisms. Every single piece of this structure works together to establish trade without ever touching the U.S. financial system or triggering secondary sanctions. Finally, Section 6, reshaping global financial systems. Zoom in out a bit. The FIAA briefing paper impartially concludes that this unprecedented weaponization of finance might actually have some massive unintended consequences. As revisionist countries and sanctioned regimes watch assets get frozen literally overnight, they are flocking to alternative networks. This really suggests that the overuse of sanctions could unintentionally speed up the decline of US dollar hegemony. We're looking at a future where the global financial system gravitates toward intense fragmentation and currency multipolarity, structured around rival geopolitical blocs rather than purely economic considerations. Which leaves us with a pretty critical question to end this explainer on. If authoritarian regimes can successfully fund themselves through illicit internal economies, like we saw in Syria, and successfully build parallel external financial structures, like Russia is attempting to do with Asia, what happens to global accountability if the US dollar loses its leverage? If financial sanctions completely lose their bite, how exactly will the international community enforce human rights and transitional justice in the future? It's definitely a provocative thought and one that will undoubtedly shape our geopolitical landscape for decades to come. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems around you.